Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on when you're listening to this. You're listening to the Ghostwriter podcast on 1020 Radio. Listen to all of 1020's other cool shows at 1020.live. And you can listen to the previous Ghostwriter podcast at mandemhood.com/ghostwriter.
Yes, sir.
But none of them are going to be as epic as the one with my very special guest today, Mr. Henry Palmer.
Yes.
Henry, speak your truth to the world. Go.
Hello, thanks for having us, Elias. To speak truth, what would the truth be, the truth be? Here we are, and we're going to be talking about...
he's a bit hungover, it would seem.
No, I actually am putting... Yeah, no, I'm a little bit... I was out last night.
Who are you? Tell us a little bit about you, Henry.
So, I'm Bristol born and bred, stand-up, writer, caretaker, commentariat, precarious individual, and so I've been doing stand-up for 3 years. I try to do abstract, alternative material, throw a night around the corner with people's comedy, where we pay acts, which is unusual for a stand-up night. I'm a writer, so I wrote a book which was published earlier this year, all about the gentrification of Bristol, which annoyed a lot of middle-class people, but they're dead now, so so we can't dwell on that, can we?
I think we're gonna
dead.
Yeah,
it's that old dictum, isn't it? Don't dwell on the dead.
I think we're gonna have to have a little competition to see how many times
who's more middle class. Oh, no. how many times I mentioned the middle class?
No, how many times you make me laugh on this podcast.
Okay.
But yeah, could you elaborate a little bit on your book on gentrification, because I think it's a very relevant topic of today. I'm gonna help sell you because that's what it is. And I think your book's very amazing. You kind of grew up in a poorer part of Bristol. You experienced a lot of interesting stuff growing up. You even mentioned that you were kind of robbed at gunpoint and stuff. And then the story behind your book is that you kind of went off to university, came back to Bristol to all this kind of gentrification and kind of like, how would you describe it?
Well, I'm a real OG, Elias, and me and my ma, we moved to Eastern Whitehall. It's the ward of Eastern. Again, and this is a semantic thing as well. It's like you comment on the BS5 Facebook page, and everyone's like, "Oh, well, first off, Whitehall Road isn't in Eastern; it's Whitehall." And anyway, so we moved there in 1998. And the European Commission said it was one of the most deprived wards in the whole southwest of England, and that was true to our experience in the following years. Like you said, being robbed at gunpoint, or seeing an American gangster stabbed, or being beat up numerous times in the area, and all these sorts of things. And and then we moved in the end, actually, because a sort of beef ting kicked off with some local kids, and I didn't really know the local kids as well because I went to school in South Bristol in 2005 to 2010. So some of my friends from South Bristol, actually sort of, which is homogenous white area, working class, were around my house. And then the local area, that there's quite a big Somali community, and some of these local kids sort of kicked off with my friend. I always wondered if it was a cultural clash, or whether it was just a generational clash, because adulthood and other things were in the cinemas at the time. But anyway, so I think it was more generational. But it kicked off, and then in the weeks to follow, there was, they threw brick at my window, and we got pushed up the housing register list because of that. And then we moved further east to Speedwell. But then, fast forward 6 years, when I just finished uni, I came back to Bristol from Kent. I was studying philosophy and film studies between 2013 and 2016, and everyone was speaking about Eastern, where I was from, was nice and up and coming. It was really weird. So then, and a bit bittersweet, really. So then, just sort of explored it more and more, and it led to a publication.
And what's the book called?
Voices of Bristol, Gentrification and Us. I would say it's available in all good bookstores, but it's not. There's Waterstones. around the corner, Bristol Clothing Pushers, Stokes Croft China, and Amazon, and my bedroom. So,
and do you want to just maybe talk a little bit about what you found out? Because if I'm correct, you kind of interviewed a lot of people in the local Bristol community, and all sorts of different issues came up.
Yeah. So in terms of consequences of gentrification being the replacement of a typically lower socioeconomic group by a higher socioeconomic group to be the most broad. The consequences negative, I sort of distinguish between cultural and financial. So cultural consequences being something like feeling isolated in your community. Well, actually, we're speaking about financial first. So not being able to afford your area anymore. You know, you've got no chance of renting below £750, £800 in Easton now. So you'd have to do HMO. But you can't afford that. And if you come from those areas, traditionally, you're more likely to be poor anyway. Not being able to buy a house. I mean, when we moved there, the area at the time that I was talking about, in the late 90s, the average house price around that area was about, I remember it was something like times 4 average annual income to buy a house, and now it's, as you'll know, is about between 11 and 14 times. So that's more financial consequences, and then cultural consequences would be like not feeling comfortable in the area anymore. So in North Street, for example, down in Southville, which has become increasingly distinct from Bedminster, you have Nor'Westers complaining that they don't like Southville, North Street, because not enough places sell Thatcher's Gold. So that for them is a cultural clash. It's like, or what would it be? It would be, or not being able to afford a panino. It's panino, by the way, not panini. Yeah, that's mental, isn't it? Everyone's been saying panini for a long time, but panini's plural. Yeah, but anyway, for £3.50, £4, and so forth.
Is panini an Indian thing then?
No. It's Italian.
Italian,
they got a place up the road where I work as a caretaker, and Coral Cafe. It's really lovely, actually. It's much better than what used to be there. And they advertise it as panino, not panini. So pretty wild.
That's interesting, man. Yeah, man. Obviously, gentrification's a big issue in today's age, and I think it's cool that someone homegrown in Bristol was like hit it kind of head on in a book.
I don't know. It's been really interesting because some people have been. I think it gives me a bit of authority. I think otherwise, if I was saying what I was saying, people would be a lot more. They would get their back up a lot more. But because I can talk from personal experience, they're necessarily more receptive, I think.
And you're also you do a lot of other work as well. So you're often sort of doing social campaigning for Labour, right? The Labour Party.
Yeah.
And when I kind of bumped into you on the street the other day, you were about to hand out some flyers for Labour, right? Yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of canvassing, a lot of door knocking for Labour. Labour has the biggest membership of any political party, probably now in all of Europe, I think, and that's really where the strength has been, and it's been phenomenal. I think we've been setting records, to be honest, across the country. If you look in Boris Johnson's constituency, there were something like, there was in one constituency, there was like 700 people, like 600 people showed up or something. It was insane to do door knocking. So it's been really great. I've managed to convert some people. So managed to convert some people on the door. Sometimes it's easy. It's just like, hi, just gonna ask a question if that's okay. Will you be voting for? And they're like, probably Conservative. And then you're like, okay. And the only other question is, if there was one thing that could be done to make your life easier, what would it be? And she was like, minimum wage increase. I'm like, well, that's exactly what Labour stand for. And then this actually happened, and she was like, "Oh, go on then, put me down for Labour." And I was like, "Wow!" And
That's crazy.
sometimes and there's another time I was sitting down with a, well, no, I wasn't sitting down, but I was speaking to a ex-police officer for about 20 minutes, about 20 minutes on the doorstep, and so that was a bit of a longer slog. But if you're just speaking about why you personally care about Jeremy Corbyn or the Labour cause, and you just speak from the heart, that's what really gets into people. You know, instead of trying to say that the vox pops of, our Green New Deal. You know, if you just say something like, for me, you talk about universal basic income, you talk about, the jobs that you've done, the pain that you've seen your mum go through working in a retail job, and thousands of millions of other people, and you just say that's the type of people I care about, and I can't think about anybody else caring about them. It necessarily taps into the people's heartstrings, and they're like, do you want to start dating? But so
yeah. And also,
it's also great for pulling people. I think I that's what I really care about.
Of course you do, mate. But what's really interesting, I think, about you being so passionate about Labour and whatnot, is that, there's a lot of talk about young people being very disillusioned with politics, especially sort of domestic party politics. I'm one of them, if I'm honest with you, man. I'm sick of it. I actually despise quite a lot of it. But you, as a young person, how do you like navigate that, and how do you feel as a young person who has a passion for politics, and why do you have that?
I think for me, it's all in the policies, and I mean, lots of people. I mean, I have a lot of debates with my family. There's a few conservatives in my family, but not posh conservatives, working class people who've done good conservatives. Every man's an island. You're an individual. Everyone can do it. So I have a lot of debates with them. One of my uncles talks about back in the 80s, he was working in Avonmouth in North Bristol, and the union. I think he talks about a time when he thinks the unions had too much power, and he said that so they wanted to go on strike to get a raise, and so they did it, and they got the raise, and he wanted to go back to work so he could earn for his family and everything. But they said no, and they said because they wanted even more bigger rise, and he didn't cross the picket, as they say. But that for him was the unions being greedy. There's a weird anecdote he tells me about when they were in the office one day, and there was a banana or something on the floor, or a wrapper, and they were like, "Oh, there's a bit of rubbish on the floor," and then the guy was like, "It's not my job to pick it up," and like that for him is, he sees that as excessive union control and power, and I hear that and I think, all right, but there's no unions nowadays in like we're saying, in retail jobs or in a lot of jobs out there. There's no worker representation, so that's one of my sort of reasons for being so passionate about the Labour cause. I went to Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival in Dorset to perform comedy in the summer, and Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival is where the trade union cause really took root. It was in the 1830s. 6 agriculture workers were facing a pay cut by the landowners, and so what they did is they came together. I think they call it a Wycomore tree or sycamore tree, and they said a pledge. They said, okay, we're going to work together and we're going to fight against this. They got found out. They were sent to labour camps in Australia. And then in the aftermath of that, 800 people found out about it in around the country. 800 people signed a petition, which is amazing, without social media or whatever, the internet. And they were pardoned and brought back. But we performed Common there, and Corbyn was there, and See, this is obviously somebody, who really does care about workers and worker representation and just a levelling of the playing field, relatively speaking. He actually walked past us when we were there, and my mate, he was there last year, 2018, and Corbin walked past, and I was just like, peace, man. I don't know what was wrong with me. I just sort of did the peace, and I was like, peace, man. I don't think he clocked it, or if he did, I think he was just embarrassed to respond. But then my mate saw him as well. They were literally, man, like as far distant as you and me are now. And my mate was just like, "Hey, Corbin," and I was like, and then he looked at him and he like, "Hello," and he gave that little like Merry Christmas smile. And I was like, dude, he actually recognised. Did he looked right at you? And my mate was just really nonchalant. John Matthews, who I threw People's Comedy with, was just like, oh yeah, he recognised me because we spoke about our allotments last year. But anyway, sorry. So,
why should people vote Labour in the next election?
Yeah. So I honestly think that loads of reasons. I mean, like things like. Loads of reasons. Like, for example, I told you I was an Uber driver. I was an Uber driver for over a year. Increasingly, technology is replacing jobs. It won't be long until the Uber job is obsolete because cars are self-driving. So, what's going to happen soon is you're going to have a question of whether you create new jobs, for the sake of humans working, or if you start to think about humans being liberated via or emancipated through technological growth. Marx spoke about this in a publication called, or something he wrote called, A Tangent on Machines.
Mark who?
Marx. Karl Marx.
Oh, Karl Marx. Yeah.
And so this is a really, really big question that's going to be coming up soon. And the Conservatives undoubtedly will say, let's create new jobs. Man needs to work. Let's just find new jobs for them to do. Labour won't. Labour will humour seriously, and they are. I've been speaking about it already, about things like universal basic income.
Big thing in the States with a man called Andrew Yang. Have you heard of?
Yeah, the Yang Gang.
Yang Gang, all the way.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because the question is as well is you imagine that you and me were on, we were getting £1,000 a month. I mean, I know what I would be doing. I would be being entrepreneurial, and I would. Like I got business plans and I would try and pursue them. But what would you do? And other people, I don't know if it's necessarily the case that everyone would. Because one of the arguments against it is that people would just become slobs. But then the people who are for it say, well, actually, no, people will be more entrepreneurial, paradoxically, because they have a safety blanket, so they're more willing to take risks. But is that just ideology right there?
You don't know until you try it, man. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think I love the idea. And the Jetsons comes to mind. The Jetsons, like that, the Flintstones in space.
There is a sinister angle to it, though, from like a sort of capitalist corporate idea of, look, actually, this is something that big corporations want because as, more marginalised people in society don't have the capital, it's a way of giving them capital to continue consuming. So I think that's a slightly eerie element of it. But at the end of the day, it's survival as well, man. If people need that grand a month or whatever it is to get by and buy their food and whatever, then like it's important.
Yeah, I think. But then you imagine that the basic things that humans need to survive are being provided for by machines. So travel. Well, in shelter, which we already have, I suppose, but then therefore state housing, as far as I'm concerned. That's another reason to vote Labour, as far as I'm concerned, so it relates to gentrification, where gentrification is basically a housing crisis. It's when housing's unaffordable. That's the main root cause. So Labour is brilliant because Labour are proposing all these policies which would really slow it down and just make it. Gentrification. Also, the root of the word French is gentil, is which is highborn, noble, and you only have that concept because you have classes in society. You have some people who are posher, some people are more middle class. the fact is, if you have an equalising of the playing field, or these groups are going to be less distinct. But Labour proposed policies like repealing the right to buy. So the right to buy your council house, stop that. I mean, Bristol in 1980, 33% of houses were council. Now there's 13% because they've all been bought up. And you think, oh, cool. But then what you don't realise is that 45% of those houses, if we're going to go on national average, now belong to buy-to-let landlords. Which is obviously not a sustainable career for one thing. It's not a sustainable system, and it also dispels the myth that our parents' generation say to us when they're okay boomer, when they're like, but I don't know why they sound like that. Nobody in my family sounds like that I know. But they're just like, we did it, so you can do it as well. Do you know what I mean? So no, we can't actually, because when you were buying houses, it was about 4 times average income. When we're buying houses, it's about 14 times, mate. So okay, boomer. Repealing right to buy, land value tax. Instead of just
what about not to bring the most horrible political wedge in human society into the conversation, but how about his policy on Brexit?
Yeah, so I like it as well, because Brexit so far has cost us £80 billion, and nobody
so far
exactly, and nobody.
In what way? Sorry.
In terms of the bureaucracy and the creation of new jobs, and the communication back and forth between the continent and Britain. So about £80 billion, that's 8,000 million, has been incurred the last 3 years since the vote. Nobody voted for that. It's not to be patronising to people that did vote, because there are reasonable reasons to vote for Brexit. For example, recently, between 11 and 14 countries in the bloc voted against wanting to crack down on tax havens. And you just think, well, what's that about? But then on the other side of the coin, you also see that the EU were also those who have been trying to crack down on tax havens like the Channel Islands. So it's a complicated affair, obviously. I don't like the Lib Dems policy of just
revoking it
completely. No, I do think that is wholly anti-democratic. The Conservatives are spouting lies in saying that they can have it done by the end of January. They won't, because they still need to get the bill passed for a deal. So I like Labour's idea of putting it back to the people, quite simply, and saying, look, just one more go with this. This is established here what we're going to do. And what's interesting is that because Corbyn is presumed to be anti-EU, is that actually the fears that he won't negotiate a good deal are probably well-founded. It probably won't be a best deal, and the fact is, why would the EU give a good deal when they want you to stay anyway? But this election is basically a Brexit vote anyway. This is it's effectively a Brexit vote again.
I think obviously he's come under criticism because he isn't taking a side, but I think there's a level of maturity to it. I'm no wizard on our politics, but I think that there's something very humbling about that choice and giving it to the people again, and the people will be like, oh well, we'll have another referendum, then another referendum, but actually,
okay boomer,
we got too many misinformed people voting in the first election anyway, and that's not undermining the people who knew what they were voting for. It's just establishing that a lot of people didn't know what they were voting for.
I still don't think they do. Do you know what I mean? It's
and again, it's like this time, if there was another vote, that there's going to be a huge pressure to give the most honest and informative reflection upon what Brexit really means. And again, you don't know, because at the end of the day, if people vote to remain, then the question's over and we can get on with shit. Or if people are to vote for this deal that Corbyn drafts up or whatever, then at least we know that we are definitely wanting, in some shape or form, out of the EU. But again, it's difficult because it's very dependent on this deal.
Especially the disenchanted voters of Brexit didn't vote for American patents in the NHS to be extended, which would lead to cheaper drugs being more expensive in the long run than they would otherwise be, which is what the document that Corbyn brought up on stage of talks between America and the UK stated the other day. It didn't actually say, we're going to sell off the NHS, but what it did say is that American patents will seriously be considered for extension, so, but that almost certainly is a consequence of not being in the EU and the so-called free trade agreement with other countries. People didn't vote for that, people. It's scary though, man, because it's really insidious that some people are actually seriously considering the prospect of, this is regressive, of paying for healthcare. There's this one guy down south I know, in like Plymouth, Portsmouth or somewhere, and he's like, oh yeah, well actually £25 for an appointment wouldn't be bad. I'm like, yeah, but wouldn't you just prefer it for free? Like, what's wrong with you? But this is what I know that you've spoken. No, but you've spoken before about identity politics. I remember. This is what it comes down to. Is that?
Let's get into that.
Yeah, I don't really understand. I don't really understand it, to be honest. I suppose it's just. I get it. I get it in the Labour groups. I go around with a lot of Labour groups, and I go around with.
Exercise your white male privilege right now, bro. Yeah. No, I think we should segue into that because the Brexit and it can all.
I wish they could see my side part.
It could go on forever. I think also this identity politics and whatever it fits into the anti-Semitism row within Labour as well and Corbyn. I'd be interested to kind of briefly hear what you think about that. I think it's kind of ridiculous. It's like, come on, man. Racism permeates society in so many different manifestations, in different ways, that to try and highlight one thing and try and paint someone like Corbyn, man, he's sweet granddad over here, as if he's anti-Semitic. I think it's kind of ridiculous. But yeah, on the subject of identity politics, how do you feel about it? I know where I stand. I know that there's it's a mixture of media inflammation and provoking that I think goes on by giving certain people platforms and looking for sound bites and headlines, like we were saying, like, all white people are racist or all men are trash. Like, this is
Jeremy Corbyn's a racist.
This is the kind of thing that the media loves to pick up on and put out there, and then suddenly everyone feels scared of identity politics when actually identity politics is just rooted in kind of a targeted history of oppression against certain communities, very much based in history, not something that has very much evolved and changed in the modern day. I like to reference things like there are many wealthy middle-class black people today. There are many poor black people still over in Africa and stuff. There are many poor white people, and you know what I mean. So it's like it's all a bit of a crazy mix-up. Identity is not one thing.
Nah, but this is where I think whatever group you're in, the concessions are necessary. So in a lot of the leftist groups that I find myself in, I do like to be. It shouldn't even be contrarian, but it is with certain things. I don't like. I get really worried and scared when everyone's agreeing with one another, and I feel very uncomfortable. Something like freedom of movement, for example, I'm not the biggest advocate of. I filed a freedom of information request recently to Bristol City Council to ask what percentage of Bristol City Council's council housing, which is about 30,000, I think it was, is occupied by different ethnic groups, and a significant amount was occupied by the Somali community. I think about 1,500, which is about 5%, which is disproportionate to what they are as a population of Bristol. I think that's the Somali community is something like 1%, something along those lines. But then this is where a really interesting disparity between refugee and asylum seeker comes in. as opposed to economic migrant. But then, as soon as you start, but then what you see as a result of that, and especially in the last 10, 15 years, is people, prejudice people in certain more homogenous areas, working class areas, whatever, saying, oh, they come over here, you know, they take all our housing and all the rest of it. And obviously that's not true, but what they're getting at there is onto something. It's onto some sort of disproportionate provision. So you need to confront that, and you need to say, okay,
without being labelled a racist.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and just saying. I mean, but this actually happened with one of my mates. I brought this up. I was literally just spitballing because I had an idea. I wanted to do an article for the Cable for it, but I don't think they were up for it in the end, which is fair. And I was talking about it, and, you know, this really reactionary response was like, yeah, well, I probably want a housing as well if my country had been raped and pillaged for centuries. I was like, what? Like, you know, you know, there's all sorts of things with that. I mean, Britain had Somalia as a protectorate in 1884. But that was only part of it. That was Somaliland, and then the south belonged to Italy, and then the north to France. You know, so it's
your history, bro.
A bit in Somalia. Well, we're going to be. I work for my publisher now. We're going to be putting together a publication actually about Somali British lifestyle. So we're going to. Yeah,
I know some Somali Bristolians as well that would be good to chat to.
Yeah, that could be cool because, you know, there's all sorts of. Clashes between the Somalilanders and the state of Somali people. I'm just really interested because it's been it's quite an insular community generally in Britain. There's not all these sort of, you know, areas where you can just like, oh, you want to go to the pub? Oh right, yeah, you don't drink, fair enough. And they're like, oh, do you want to, you know, come and have some nice mindful prayer? Oh yeah, you're an atheist because you're, you know, British and you got loads of atheists here. Do you know what I mean? It's like
culture clash.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of. It'd be really interesting to explore the Somali community more and more, and just the idea is to better represent it for a publication.
But yeah, I guess so.
With my white privilege.
On that.
By the way, that is a question that comes up. Is like with the gentrification work, it was like, you know, because I was looking at things like St. Paul's, for example, becoming less Caribbean, at least, not necessarily more white, because the Somali community, so happens, it increased from 2001 to 2011. Specifically Jamaican British population there reduced from 16.3% to 8.3%. But also the white population reduced as well, so it's not just as simple as whitewashing. Mm-hmm. But the Somali community was the biggest, had the biggest growth, to something like 45%. And then I started to read more into Caribbean history, there's a book by Ken Price, a sociologist from Trinidad. He published it in the late 70s, and it was a sociological work on St. Paul's. And that was really interesting because he had this dichotomy between the different groups in the Caribbean population.
Of course, yeah.
And it's ridiculous because I grew up next to Jamaicans, but you know, I learned all these sorts of things that I didn't otherwise know, and I suppose it makes sense because that's what happens when you read books. But I didn't know that everyone didn't speak patois, for example, in Jamaica. Like, you know, it's considered a lower class sort of way of speaking, and that there was, broadly speaking, there were two groups that he distinguished, and it was basically the respectables, if you like, and then those who aren't. And he explained, and so you had like teeny boppers, hustlers, pimps, and then on the other side you have those who went to the Pentecostalist church, the saints he called them, and then they would judge, and obviously it's anecdotal, but it was interesting. And I've got Jamaican neighbours now, and it makes sense because I went back one day, and I remember I was just like, hey, to my mates, like this couple in my parents' generation. I was like, yeah. He was like, yeah, Emery, that's Nigel. And then his wife was there. I was like, yeah, well, go on. But I said it to her, and she looked at me like, really, like, why is he speaking like that?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's interesting, man. No, that's actually quite interesting because it is a bit.
because he was like he speaks like that. He would speak in that way, whereas
his wife doesn't.
But I've only clocked since reading the book that I was basically speaking because I think if she'd spoken in that way, it would have been all right. But because she's religious and all the rest of it, I think that came with the sort of reluctance to indulge that way of speaking. But anyway, yeah. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. It's a very complex issue, and as you're saying, within certain quote unquote marginalized communities, there are identity clashes within those subgroups, you know. So it's not black and white. Pardon the pun.
No. Although I'm very white, and I'm sorry about that. And
Have to be sorry, man.
Have you seen Who Is America?
I haven't.
So is Sacha Baron Cohen.
Oh yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, and one of the sketches is but this is it. This is the beauty of satire. Is one of the sketches he's making fun of, you know, the far left, the regressive leftist. He's like, hey, I'm a metrosexual, vegan, vegetarian, bisexual, lesbian, backflip hipster, and I'm sorry about that. But you know, and I like it. It's like, and so that's what he's like, and yeah. So that's the beauty of satire. You know, you can talk about the philosophy of humour and all that sort of thing if you want. But what was interesting though is that. And it sort of relates, I suppose, in a way to the Gary Young talk that you hosted with Mandem, is that one of my problems with it is that there was a lot of talk of the BAME community, but there was a lack of nuance there.
I can't stand the word BAME.
No, it's like, well, what do you, like...
I cannot stand it, mate.
You know, like
but you have to understand it's a
shorthand.
And it's sometimes all we're given. It's like, it's how... we can get those events done, because all the bigger organizations, perhaps run by white people, need to tick off the BAME box. So it's like, if that's the language, it's a very interesting conversation about power that you can talk about there. It's like, if that's the language that comes from power, then the powerless have no option but to kind of use their language.
Yeah.
If you go and ask the, you know, community, do you identify as a BAME person? They'll be like, what are you talking about? I wasn't made in a lab.
No.
So it's
what does that even mean? Do you know what I mean?
It's black, Asian, and minority ethnic.
I know what it means, but it's like
yeah.
It's like, what does that mean? Like,
yeah,
it's like, why are you grouping the Rasta with this humble Chinese man?
With the Polish man.
With the Polish man.
That's a minority ethnic group as well. I mean, of course, there's a ridiculousness to it, and that's something that I think people from quote unquote the BAME community need to discuss amongst themselves and understand how they articulate better what they're desiring. But you have to understand as well that it's also very much what's given to people from the top down, I think, a lot of the time, and it's not necessarily the other way around.
I mean, I think this is the thing that I have a problem with when it comes to proportional representation and opportunity and that sort of thing. Affirmative action to some degree is that, of course, I'm for it, but it has to
go to working class white people as well.
Yeah, but something that I wonder sometimes. I mean, Will Smith, for example, he boycotted Oscars a few years ago because he said not enough black actors were nominated. But then if you look at the percentage of African Americans in America, it's something like 10%. I think I could be something along those lines.
I think it's about 30%.
Is it? Sorry, is it? Excuse me. Sorry. Is it really African Americans?
I mean, because of slavery, there's a whole lot there.
I know it was. I know it was definitely about a third during Abraham Lincoln's time.
Google it.
Should we have a look? Yeah. Why not? You know, like is. But either way, my question is that is fair representation always proportional in that way? You know, for example, if
it's not.
Like Bristol's population of Chinese population is 1%, for example. You know, and that's why me and John are always really trying to get a Chinese person's kneecap on stage
as well. Yeah, that there isn't a silver bullet, and this is people trying. You know what I mean? It's like, I think we have so high expectations for society sometimes that we're like, oh well, we should be able to just cure racism overnight with this specific thing, and that's how it's going to happen, rather than realizing that we're all just humans. We ain't got a clue what we're doing here. We're trying our best, affirmative action was the best idea we could come up with. A few people put their hands up and voted for it in a room, and we ran with it. Sure, it's not perfect. We're trying. It'll improve as the years go on. Do you know what I mean?
I wonder in the years to come whether, because obviously you have increasingly a hybridization of different cultures contained in one person. You know, I'm an eighth Indian.
So you were right. About 14% African Americans make up the total population.
So we're about midway there. But you know, it's like you do wonder in the years to come whether it's going to be, you know. And I sound like I'm not trying to be like, you know, this political correctness gone mad. It's genuine me just philosophizing. Have you got your third Caribbean, third English, third Chinese quota? Like, you know, like oh well, I'm a third Chinese. Do you know what I mean?
It's ridiculous in some respects.
It's interesting though as well because
you have to analyze it from a place of education and not ignorance.
Yeah,
you know, and I get you. There's reasons that we need to worry, but you also have to remember as well. Somewhere, you know, sometimes I see it. At the end of the day, reparations payments weren't actually. This is specifically for black people rather than the rest of the demographic. But there was no reparation payment given to black people. In fact, you know, slave owners were often given reparation payments. And if you look at, that's why I think it's so important to acknowledge history, because it's like if we're looking at this as a 400-year legacy.
Yeah,
you've got to acknowledge that, like, okay, a lot of wrong was done. This isn't perfect. It's not a silver bullet, but it's kind of the least we could do to try and help some of the descendants of people who were unfairly oppressed, etc. But I know, as I say that, I do know it's completely more complicated than that.
What is interesting is also class, and how class is never really touched on much
100%.
in representation within the, you know, quote unquote BAME community.
But can I just point out that actually I came across a really cool organization called Creative Access, which is quote unquote BAME led, but they include within that working class white people. So and increasingly I'm seeing when I'm doing like my film applications and stuff, they're often asking you for your economic background. So as I said about, you know, this is a process, there's no silver bullet and it keeps improving. There is an acknowledgement from the film industry, from other industries, that this isn't just about race. This is a class thing as well. All the big corporations, all big companies, big media companies are occupied by people from middle class backgrounds, and actually it's time to give working class people a chance too.
I mean, when I was doing the gentrification work, I would use Uber as a sociological tool. So I would just be driving around, and I was like, you know, they'd get in the car and they'd be like, yeah, I drive, you busy? I'd be like, yeah, not too bad, but do you want to talk about Bristol's changing face? And so I would do research that way. And then I was speaking with this one girl in her early 30s from St. Paul's, mixed race girl, and she was talking about how she's seen a video from a local arts organisation on gentrification in Bristol, actually done by The Watershed, by Rife magazine or something. And she was like, yeah, I saw it. She's a social worker, and she was like, I didn't know any of those people, but for her, even though there were African, Jamaican, British people in this gentrification piece, she couldn't relate, she couldn't connect because they weren't from the area, they weren't working class. So yeah, I think class is a really important thing as well. It's you know, class is so important. I
completely agree with you, man.
It's, you know, you wonder sometimes, I mean, I just wonder sometimes how a working class white person sort of compares to a, I don't know, upper middle class black British person. But I only ask that or wonder that because I'm interested in the consequences sometimes of what causes prejudice, what causes discrimination, you know. And for example, I think I like the idea of what unites people is both pain and pleasure, happiness. So you think, okay, well, I have some ancestors from Wiltshire who were peasant workers, and and they toiled the land, and then, I'm interested in just investigating what the parallels between that and some of the Caribbean slaves might be, just for common ground, or just, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Just for like,
yeah.
because my ancestors weren't coasting, do you know what I mean? So the
Yeah.
the group categorization of you're white and therefore you are privileged, I think sometimes has the unexpected consequence of causing people to be more prejudiced, more discriminatory, because they become defensive then and reactionary.
Completely agree.
Whereas if you like, we went through this and it was terrible, yes, and then but just for common ground, you know.
Yeah. I mean, white working class people have a miserable history in all over Europe, and that's one of the interesting things about me being mixed races. Yeah, I've got both black heritage that does go back to slavery, and I've got heritage that goes back to white working class Scottish people, actually. So it's interesting.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, sorry. I could talk about this all day,
Yeah.
but gonna have to wrap it up in the last couple of minutes. Is there any kind of final things you want to say? And tell us about your comedy, mate, and when we can come and see that.
Yeah, the People's Comedy. So we've been going for about a year now. We run it just around the corner at People's Public Estates Croft, and also at the Lion now on Whitehall Road. Our night's we call it socio-political comedy night, but it's basically comedy with a substance, as opposed to just low hanging fruit, common denominator stuff. We pay our acts, which isn't exceptional, and unlike really any other night in the whole of the southwest of England. So each act gets paid £25, compare £35, just because we think, well, it's something. We do that through ticket sales. So the People's Comedy is what we're called. So yeah, do come down, check us out.
Yeah, for sure, man. No, I'm excited to come through. Actually, I'd love to come through, and I know it's so difficult to pack all of these things into a short space of time, and I'd love to have you back on in the future where we can just spend 40 minutes an hour completely going off on what we were talking about, because I think it is all such a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. I was actually, I'll just say this, I was supposed to be writing an essay for it was a book all about the voices of youth in essays from Britain's youth. And it was supposed to be about patriotism. I haven't got time now, but it was rejected in the end, and they didn't get back to me, even though they said that they would be in it, because the people behind it were these regressive type leftists. They were like, nah, patriotism, nationalism, we can't do anything. But anyway, another time.
I know the feeling, man. I won't go into it, but I'm sure there's some regressive leftists that have a problem with what I'm doing too. But yeah, thank you so much, Henry, for joining me. I think you're a super interesting person, and yeah, everyone go check out Henry's stuff, his comedy, his book, Voices of Bristol, Gentrification, and Us.
Yes.
Thank you very much for listening.